Without further ado, let's introduce our speaker, Lorinda Bradley, a Ph.D. and Master of Arts. MA?
Yeah.
Is the National Register Coordinator for the State Historic Preservation Office of Iowa. Previously, she taught courses in the history of architecture, art, and design for the University of Missouri-Columbia and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And she served as a Director and Curator of the Montminy Gallery in Columbia, Missouri. Bradley's research has focused on 20th century American architecture and design with a particular interest in mid-century modernism. Please welcome Lorinda Bradley.
Thanks. All right. See if I can hold this. All right, thank you. Hi, I'm Lorinda. Like the introduction said, I'm the National Register Coordinator for the state of Iowa. I attended graduate school with Dr. Iceland, and so she invited me to speak about my work and how I ended up where I am. So this approach is somewhat new for me. I'm used to giving academic talks focused on research or more recently explaining the National Register Program to the public. And so normally I focus on the work alone and those ideas, but today I thought it would be relevant for students in an art program or to students interested in history or humanities more broadly to talk about my trajectory or the process of how I ended up in the job that I have now. So I'm approaching this as kind of a hybrid. Going to balance focus on my current work after I talk about my experiences leading to this point. So I'll spend time talking about my background, interests, the advice I was given, the advice I ignored, my academic career, and my experience on the job market before ending with my time by focusing on historic preservation and the aspects of public service that I particularly enjoy. So spoiler, state government is not where I envisioned myself working when I was an undergrad or a graduate student, but I found that this unexpected career path is incredibly fulfilling, and I feel fortunate to work in a field that I care deeply about. So I definitely don't have everything figured out and don't know if I have any good advice or key takeaways for undergrads, but hopefully you can find some points in my talk to relate to and think about your ultimate career goals and priorities, I suppose. So I will start at the very beginning. I grew up on a small farm in Iowa. I was the youngest of 3 children in a working class family. So our farm had been in our family for over 150 years. Pretty idyllic place to grow up as a kid. I was pretty imaginative, creative, spent a lot of time outdoors, kind of in my own head, exploring buildings that my great-grandparents had, discarded furniture in, spent a lot of time outside. So my parents raised my siblings and I to be pretty empathetic people, have a strong work ethic. They supported us in whatever our interests were, but they made sure that we pursued them vigorously, right? They wanted someone who was motivated, or they wanted their kids to be motivated. So at school, growing up, I was good at art, reading, social studies. I really hated math and science, so from a very early age, knew that that was not going to be my area of interest. But the subjects that I was most interested in are not necessarily considered by most to be profitable, right? So every time I thought about pursuing those interests as a career option, there was usually someone telling me that that wasn't a good idea and that I should find something that was more practical to support myself. So in high school, took a lot of dual credit courses that were available so that I could get college credits. But my interests pretty much stayed the same. Social studies, history, government, and art. My high school counselors and other mentors encouraged me to pursue my interests in politics and government. Again, those would probably be the most stable as a career option. Perhaps I could be a lawyer or work in international relations. So I considered pursuing architecture, but architecture and design involve some math, so didn't really want to do that either. I finished high school really unsure of what I wanted to pursue for a career, but knowing that I wanted to experience the world outside of that really small, rural conservative town in Iowa that I grew up near. So for college, I decided to go to Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. Creighton is a Catholic Jesuit liberal arts school known for its health sciences programs and the business school. So it was somewhat of a strange choice for me. I'm not Catholic. I'm not interested in science or business. But what I was drawn to was the educational model that was there. It focused a lot on community engagement and community service. And they focused their classes on critical thinking and having dialogue with students. So I wanted that kind of interactive undergraduate education. Didn't declare a major prior to getting there. And when I enrolled, I felt a little lost. Was searching for inspiration. So following the advice of my counselors and my parents, I preliminarily expressed interest in pre-law and international relations, was added to those listservs. So the one thing my parents told me about college that they did not want me to major in was art. Right, so bad. They told me that they did not want me to be a starving artist. I vividly remember my mom explaining that to me. I could do whatever I wanted, but she did not want me to be an artist. So they wanted me to think about my future practically. Didn't want me to have to sell my creative work in order to make an income, and they really wanted to make sure all of the money that I was investing in going to this college paid off in some kind of productive career. So my first advisor at Creighton was a chemistry professor that was assigned to mentor undeclared majors. So he reinforced all of these notions that other people were telling me, right? History classes, yeah, fine, those might be somewhat useful, but do not enroll in an art class. That is not a prerequisite requirement. It will throw you off of your schedule to graduate. I wanted to graduate in 3 years. And so that would not, put me on a path towards that goal. And it, wasn't something that he considered valuable. So I was pretty stressed. Enrolling in classes, I was overall pretty responsible. I signed up for all prerequisites. I signed up for Spanish, theology, all of these courses that we had to take at Creighton. But I also had to be a little bit adversarial, and I signed up for an art history class. The introduction to art history with Dr. Matt Averett. I wanted to take a class that would spark my interest and kind of balance all of the courses that I knew that I wouldn't be necessarily interested in, but that were required. So for the first few months, I was figuring out college life, going to classes that I absolutely hated. Anthropology, atmospheric sciences, again, theology, Spanish. I had a work-study job at the university daycare that I loathed. I have a really bad gag reflex. When I smell something gross, I instantly start gagging. So in my second week, I worked in the toddler and baby room. They handed me a baby that had poop falling out of its onesie, and I went and asked to be transferred somewhere else. They could not find another placement for me, so I just had to stick through it. So I was pretty miserable, right? Classes were tough. Didn't like my job. I had an awful roommate during the first semester. So I was convinced that I had made a terrible mistake. I was at the wrong school, taking the wrong classes, in the wrong job. I was stressed, pretty desperately unhappy. But twice a week, I went to a small, dark, windowless room in the basement of the Leeds Performing Arts Center and learned about the history of art. So that was, a major reprieve for me from everything else going on. So I loved that class. I loved the professor, but this aha moment was near the end of the first semester when the TWA Flight Center popped up on the screen, and Dr. Averitt, whose research focuses on the Italian Baroque period, animatedly spoke about the design of this airport terminal and what the experience of flying was like for people in the mid-20th century when this was a relatively new phenomenon. So the TWA Flight Center was designed by Eero Saarinen in 1956, and it was completed in 1962. And I was completely transfixed by this building. It was, this complete, total design. I loved the elegant curves, envisioning the experience of sitting in this terminal, watching these jets go by the window, and I was really intrigued by this conversation pit. Because in my experience of flying, people sit in rows and they try their hardest not to talk to people. I put my headphones on. It's great if I go through, an entire flight without saying a word to one person. But that's not what it was like when flying first started, right? Eero Saarinen designed this circular pit, and so people would sit, dressed in suits and dresses, and talk excitedly about where they were going, right? It was more of an experience of flying that was carefully curated and enhanced by the design of this building. So the space was immersive, it was so elegant, and so I was completely taken by how modern design reconceptualized how people moved through space and helped control how they experienced life. So shortly after that class, I scheduled a meeting with Dr. Averitt to tell him that I wanted to major in art history, and there was no turning back for me. So I immediately switched advisors. I told my parents that I would be a professor or a curator. I would still be doing something like, surrounded by art, but I wouldn't be producing it. Instead, I would be doing something serious. I would be researching and I would be writing about it. And so that was my, kind of way around that. So would combine my interests in art, architecture, history, politics, and even if I wasn't a professor or curator, there were multiple careers that I could pursue within that context. So I justified that the study of the history of art. I would also need to be familiar with the processes and approaches to creating art, and so I minored in fine art, against, again, all of the advice that I was receiving from everyone else. So the first semester of my sophomore year, I studied abroad at the University College of London. I wanted to get out of the Midwest for a little bit, live in a global artistic center, travel while I had the opportunity. So I took classes in the history of modern art, and I also took classes in their art conservation program. So learning about the historical development and the science of paint media. Got to experience with linseed oil, walnut oil, see how it interacted with pigments. But I was really determined to make the most out of that experience. So I hadn't grown up going to art museums or galleries. The closest art museum was about 45 minutes away from home, and I had never been there before I went to college. So my family generally stayed away from cities, so didn't really go to museums at all, unless it was like the history of the Air Force or something. Went to Branson, Missouri, those kind of places for vacation. So while I was in London, I frequented the British Museum, the British Library. Those were all close to UCL. But my favorite place in the city was the Tate Modern, which is on the screen. The Tate Modern is located in a decommissioned power station along the River Thames. And when the power station closed in the early 1980s, it took over a decade for London to determine a new use for the property. There were proposals to demolish the building. A lot of people thought it was incredibly ugly, this hideous monstrosity that took up prime real estate real estate within the center of London. But preservation activists campaigned to save the building. and encourage adaptive reuse. In the mid-1990s, the Tate Gallery announced that they would convert the building to their new modern art museum, and so the Tate Modern finally opened in 2000, 20 years after the power station closed. So I loved this building and its galleries. This is where I spent the most time. I would just sit on the floor, looking at paintings, spend, a lot of my free time there. So I was also fascinated how this art museum, you could still discern that it used to serve a different function. So on the right is the turbine hall. So you can see, how it still has this really massive industrial infrastructure for this building, but repurposed to now house really great art exhibitions that are really experiential, massive. And there's a sculpture installation. So when I got back to Omaha, I started exploring that local art scene a bit more, trying to understand what it looked like within the context of the Midwest. I grew up in a small town, again, not going to art museums, and then all of a sudden I was in London and that was my life. So what did this look like in Omaha? So to select the subject for my senior thesis, my advisor encouraged me to find something at the Joslin Art Museum, which was located pretty close to Creighton. So the Joslin has a very large collection of art of the American West. And at the time, they've gotten a major donation since then, but at the time they had a really small collection of modern and contemporary art. And so my advisor encouraged me to do something on Western art, hated it. Did not want to look at cowboys. And so one of the paintings that was hanging on the wall in the American galleries was Grant Wood's Stone City, Iowa. And so I was looking into Grant Wood's work more, became interested in his time leading the Public Works of Art project in Iowa, which was related to the WPA or the FSA in terms of government-funded art programs during the Great Depression. So for my senior thesis, I wrote about post office murals in Iowa. Traveling across the state, I documented murals, considered how government programs supported art that represented local histories and communities. So I think it was 3% of every government building budget needed to go towards sculpture, painting, some kind of artistic decoration for the building. So I was intrigued by how people interacted with this artwork. They'd go to be mailing a letter and then see this incredible mural, in the course of their daily lives. So how government-sponsored artwork could impact people throughout the state. So the Joslin Museum of Art was located near Creighton, and so was the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts. After I graduated, I interned at the Bemis, and they opened Michael Jones McKean's Rainbow Project. So I got to see the process for planning such a technically complex exhibition. So the project incorporated 6 10,500-gallon tanks that collected rainwater. So it took a really long time to plan for this exhibition and collect all of that water each time they wanted to create a rainbow over the building. There were pumps that delivered the water up to the roof where nozzles sprayed the water at a rate of 2,000 gallons per minute to create that massive rainbow that you see on the screen. So I was really compelled by the planning, the collaborative process of those art exhibitions. It was a massive amount of time and effort, and a lot of contributions were involved to make this event happen, and it was something that only lasted for a couple minutes, but I was fascinated. As an intern, I did the grunt work though. I was sweeping up the rocks beside the tanks, making sure there was no dead birds laying beside them after they hit a window, the less glamorous aspects of helping with the exhibition. So all of these experiences from college, all of these interests, architecture, museums, government-sponsored arts projects, collaborative art experiences. All of those eventually coalesced into my focus of modern design and architecture as a graduate student at the University of Missouri. I started grad school in the fall of 2012. That's where I met Dr. Aislinn. We were in the same Introduction to Graduate Studies class. She was on the archaeology side of things at that point. I had applied in the program to work with Kristen Schwain, who is an Americanist, and also Keith Egner, who was an architectural historian that focused on modern architecture. In my second semester, I took a course in the history of modern architecture, and through that class was introduced to the work of Charles and Ray Eames, particularly the Eames House, which was built in California in 1949 as part of another major project. This one was sponsored by an architecture magazine, and they, anticipated this wartime shortage or after housing shortage after World War II. And so, how could you use industrial materials that were created within the context of wartime production and use that to solve a problem with a housing shortage? They're probably best known for their furniture designs. Their chair is right there. That's one of their most iconic pieces. If that looks familiar, it's on a lot of television shows, Mad Men. I think there's one in the show Archer that they use for an office chair. But what intrigued me about this property was how the Eameses utilized this minimal industrial architecture of modernism, but filled it with layers and layers of stuff that they had collected over the years. I also have a lot of stuff, so I was interested in how they were incorporating all of these things that were seemingly unrelated from different cultures, historical periods, and pairing them together so that things that were from disparate locations around the world, they were revealing patterns and similarities with something that was from a completely different context. But as I researched for my master's thesis, I became increasingly interested in how the history of art had focused on the Eameses' achievements in architecture and furniture. But when looking more closely at their entire careers, the couple seemed to focus far more time and attention on designing exhibitions and pedagogy, educational experiences. So their furniture has become, again, pretty iconic, but no one seemed to be talking about, what they spent most of their time on, creating films, interpreting concepts of math and science, which I hated, to a wider public, right? How do you make those subjects, which are seemingly boring, visually exciting and engaging for a general public? So I ended up focusing my dissertation on these types of exhibits. So on all my time I spent avoiding math and science, I wrote about math and science exhibits. So focused on that aspect of the Eameses' work. Started with their designs of furniture showrooms, again, those museum exhibitions, university curriculum. They coordinated with the US government. That was one of their major sponsors, and also IBM. And so they were interpreting the computer as it was developing for the public, again, trying to make that accessible. Showing how the computer had actually come from typewriters and earlier forms of word processing to show that it was, this kind of historically based development and that computers actually weren't scary and going to lead to the end of the world. I received a few different fellowships that allowed me to spend 2 summers researching the Eameses' extensive archives in the Library of Congress and the Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C. Again, I really thrived being in a city where there was so much art and culture, and so the 2 summers that I spent there were also between 2016 and 2017, so that was just before and after a major presidential election. So D.C. was also a very active place in terms of politics and government, and just a really fascinating place to be during that time. I really loved the archival research. going through those materials, making connections between things that were in folders, hundreds and hundreds of folders and boxes. But what I struggled most in grad school was actually completing the writing aspect of it. I loved research, but I had a lot of anxiety about writing, about presenting research, worried that the arguments I made were not novel, that what I was talking about wasn't necessarily important, or that I wouldn't be able to articulate my ideas in a way that my colleagues would, think was intelligent. So perhaps my anxiety about writing and presenting research was a sign that academia and publishing probably wasn't, my ultimate career path, and something that would come easy to me or something that I would particularly enjoy. But I loved the subjects and loved research, just consuming a lot of information and memorizing facts and having conversations about all of these topics are really what excited me. So, don't have any visuals for this because it's pretty boring. But throughout my time in grad school, I kept myself open in terms of career trajectories. I don't know if this was Dr. Eisland's experience, but this was mine. In courses of preparing future faculty, talking to some faculty members, books prepping graduate students for the job market, I was constantly told that I needed to develop a 5-year plan. I needed an ultimate idea of what I wanted to do so that I could work out what steps I needed to take to get there. But for me, that didn't seem so simple. I was interested in so many different aspects of art and design history that I found it difficult to focus on one single career goal. So I had graduate assistantships in grad school at the Museum of Art and Archaeology, as a gallery director in the Student Center, as a teaching assistant in art history and film studies, and I loved it all, right? I enjoyed aspects of each one of those positions and the different perspectives of art and design that they allowed. The museum and gallery positions incorporated research and visually designing spaces. Exhibition design was the focus of my research, so this is a way that I could physically practice those ideas that I was reading so much about. Teaching allowed me to curate pedagogical material, discuss topics that interested me, but most importantly, I really loved working with students. I loved hearing their ideas, the ways they challenged things that I thought I knew, asked questions, also discussing their career objectives with them. Another aspect that I didn't like about selecting a specific path was that I was really aware of the difficult job market for art historians. I graduated high school in 2009 in the midst of an economic recession and had seen a lot of graduate students before me in the University of Missouri program who had struggled to get jobs in art history and archaeology. So I didn't want to restrict myself to one thing in case that didn't work out, but instead left myself open to multiple career paths depending on what was available when I graduated. Ultimately, I'm really happy that I chose this approach because the job market was not particularly kind when I graduated. I completed my dissertation in 2020, so in the midst of the global pandemic. A number of available positions that I was applying for and interviewing for were pulled. Museum positions dwindled. Job openings that existed were extremely competitive. So I spent a lot of that summer feeling pretty bad, demoralized, depressed that I had dedicated the last 12 years of my life towards pursuing this thing that I loved, focused my entire energy on art history, had gotten a majority of the fellowships that I had applied for. I was really lucky in that, presented at conferences. I did everything that I was supposed to do, but ultimately, my timing was off, and I convinced myself that it was only going to get worse as more and more people graduated and flooded the market. So I felt like I had been on the precipice of finally accomplishing, things that I had wanted for my career, things that I had strived for since I was an undergrad, declaring art history as my major, only to be confronted with the real possibility that I completely failed and would be unemployed. On top of that, I had impending student loan debts to pay off. And so those were, crowding my thoughts. So there were two initial job opportunities that arose unexpectedly at the end of that summer that helped me navigate life post-grad school. So first, I was hired as the Director and Curator of the Montminy Gallery, which is an endowed art gallery at the Boone County History and Cultural Center. And second, a graduate student and friend from Mizzou connected me with an online instructor position, teaching the history of architecture to students at Marywood University in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So the Montminy had archives and collections that had been pretty mismanaged and poorly organized by previous curators. It was only a part-time position, so I spent much of that time not only curating exhibitions of contemporary artists from Missouri, but also working to catalog artworks and work with archival material. The online teaching position enabled me to continue working with students, teaching a subject that I was knowledgeable about and interested in. And although this was not an ideal situation or job scenario that I had wanted or thought was possible for myself just a few months earlier, I was still working in my field. I was still collaborating with artists on exhibitions, engaging with students while continuing to apply for full-time positions. I also was able to teach as a visiting instructor at Mizzou, and so that helped supplement my income for a while. I continued those positions for about a year and a half while I did some real reevaluating. Tough job market during the pandemic really forced me to think more broadly about what I wanted to do for a career, where I wanted to live and why, and really what my priorities were. So I reoriented my approach to job applications and had difficult conversations with my partner about what we needed at a minimum to be happy, regardless of whether a particular career fit into my preconceived ideas of what success was. So rather than apply to every position in art history or in museums that became available, I took a very targeted approach and only applied to positions that were in the proximity to my family in Iowa. So we're very close to my family, my husband's family. And so in the uncertainty of the pandemic, when I was at my lowest points, they were still there, right? And we determined that over any career aspirations, our families were extremely important and we wanted to be close to them. I had also been traveling for work, living away from my husband, and so we wanted to live together, which is crazy. So I had missed out on a lot of life events in my family, focusing on my education, right? That was my sole focus. Didn't do a lot of social activities, missed out on a lot of life events. So I started searching for a way to balance those career aspirations and also being close to my people. So I spent more time making sure my applications were curated towards each position, highlighting my investment in really staying in the Midwest. And in the spring of 2022, I accepted a visiting assistant professor position at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, while also teaching an online course for the University of Missouri. I got to teach my dream class. I taught a class in the history of modern contemporary American fiber arts, which is extremely diverse, really women-centric, and an area of study that was still actively developing. That fall, I began teaching as a full-time instructor at Mizzou, coordinating the School of Visual Studies internship program and applying to more positions throughout the Midwest. But I also started looking at other positions that were adjacent to art history, namely government positions in historic preservation. So my grad school friend and colleague who had connected me with the position at Marywood University encouraged me to branch out and apply for government jobs, which I had not considered prior to that point. I joined a local historic preservation commission for the community that I lived in, began rehabilitating a house that was built in the 1860s during my free time, And so I used that as kind of a physical and creative outlet while I was applying. So I was one of a few final candidates for a couple jobs that I desperately wanted, but ultimately each of those fell through. And finally, in the spring of 2023, I saw a posting for my current position as the National Register Coordinator for the state of Iowa. So my degree qualifies me for that position, and I focused on how my interest in architecture and design, my research and teaching experience, and my work coordinating galleries and internship programs could be transferable and beneficial for coordinating state and federal programs. So I met my current coworkers during my interview process. We instantly clicked. Although I was not in academia pursuing my own research and teaching, I was still working directly with other historians, architects, archaeologists, all people who were dedicated to historic preservation and had a deep commitment to community development. So what's more, I could work in my home state in a city that I was familiar with and that I loved, the state capital, Des Moines, and I could be more present for my family. So I don't have my own kids, but it's extremely valuable to me to be able to attend my nieces and nephews' birthday parties and all of their activities and be there for their major life events. So I've so far been able to balance those professional goals and personal values that had, eluded me a lot of my time during graduate school. So I'm doing something that I love and that I feel contributes significantly to the communities in my state. So historic preservation, thought I'd go a little bit into this field and then talk about what my job actually encompasses. So historic preservation is the effort to protect and maintain buildings, objects, landscapes, and other artifacts that hold historic, cultural, or architectural significance. And in practice, it involves identifying, protecting, enhancing, and interpreting those resources for future generations. So in the United States, the first national preservation efforts were spearheaded by women. Who run the world? So the oldest national historic preservation organization was the Mount Vernon Ladies Association for the Union, which was founded in 1853 after a woman received a letter from her mother lamenting about the degrading condition of Mount Vernon, where George Washington had lived. Washington's descendants couldn't afford to maintain the property and attempted to sell it to the Commonwealth of Virginia and also to the federal government, who both said, no, thank you. We do not want to invest the money in maintaining this resource. So the women wrote, one woman who founded the organization, Cunningham, she wrote to her mother stating, if the men of America have seen fit to allow the home of its most respected hero to go to ruin, why can't the women of America band together to save it? So together they raised over $200,000 needed to purchase the estate, and they finally took possession in 1860 after spending several years convincing Washington's descendants to sell the property to a group of women, which they were not excited about. So soon after, other efforts quickly started developing for historic preservation. So 1872, Yellowstone National Park was designated as a protected area. 1889, Casa Grande designated as the first national monument with an appropriation of $2,000. 1906, the Antiquities Act imposed stiff penalties for destroying federally owned sites and gave the president authority to designate historic landmarks. And in 1916, the National Park Service was established to manage, preserve, and regulate the use of federal and national historic sites for the enjoyment of future generations. The mid-20th century saw rapid growth in American suburbs and the increased reliance on automobile transportation, and this was a preservation nightmare. The 1850s, the interstate highway system was championed by the Eisenhower administration and had a significant impact on the built environment. Rural areas, traffic was redirected away from towns that had relied on roadside commerce. And in urban areas, the construction of highways resulted in the removal of buildings and the demolition of entire neighborhoods. Usually those were neighborhoods where minorities or underrepresented communities lived. So this is a picture of Des Moines, where Highway 235 demolished historically Black neighborhoods. So highway programs, along with the Housing Act of 1949 and the Urban Renewal Act of 1954, resulted in large areas of cities and areas that politicians called blighted, making way for new construction and development. A pivotal moment in historic preservation in the United States was the demolition of New York's Penn Station in 1963. The building was designed and opened just 53 years before the proposed demolition in 1910. It was considered a masterpiece of Beaux Arts style, and the main building occupied an 8-acre plot in Midtown Manhattan. And in 1962, the company that owned the air rights for the property announced plans for the new Madison Square Garden that would result in the demolition of this building. So justification for the demolition included exorbitant costs for maintaining the building, the relative decline in rail passenger service, the outdated style of the building, and that real estate value had increased dramatically, rendering the building an inefficient use of land. So they also claimed that the financial gain from the new sports center and office tower would offset any aesthetic loss of this building. There were protests, international outrage, but the decision to raise Penn Station was made in a corporate boardroom approved by the City Planning Commission. And on October 28th, 1963, the destruction of Penn Station began. It took 3 years to take down the building. And as history has it, new plans are now being considered to expand the rail terminal due to increased commuter traffic, and one proposed project includes moving Madison Square Garden and replacing it with a train station. So the National Register was established in the National Preservation Act of 1966. It's been amended several times to be more inclusive of tribal rights and other areas of preservation that the original act ignored. So the National Register is a tool that provides the basis for both the recognition of significant historic resources and also their preservation. So National Register nominations include information about historic resources, and they're essentially planning documents. You describe a building, do an analysis of its significance, identify what we call character-defining features. What about this building signifies its significance? What is important about this building that represents the historical period that it acquired significance in? So historic preservation, it is not about preventing change, right? It's just about carefully considering where and when changes are made with a regard for historic resources. So the National Register also facilitates the review of federally funded, licensed, or permitted projects. So if the DOT or HUD proposes a project, those federal agencies have to determine what the impact of that project is on historic resources in the area. If federal funds are involved, they have to consider how those projects might destroy historic resources, whether or not they're listed in the National Register. That's the criteria that they use to determine historic significance. National Register listed properties are also eligible for a number of grants, and they're eligible for historic tax credit programs to rehabilitate and adaptively reuse these buildings for new purposes, to give them new life. So being listed in the National Register is a requirement for a lot of those programs. And so it details the history of the property, again, why it's significant, and what needs to be maintained when these buildings are reused for something else. So overall, a nomination helps document and define what's important about a building, a resource, and is the basis for those programs. So in my job, I not only read those National Register nominations, provide feedback, make sure that it fits the standards of the program. Each state has a SHPO, a State Historic Preservation Office, which is kind of the ultimate middleman between the public and the National Park Service. So we review everything, make sure that it meets those standards, and ultimately send it up to the National Park Service for listing. But I work in the National Register program, reviewing nominations, but I also manage a large part of Iowa's historic property inventory and work as a reviewer in the historic tax credit program. So there are both federal and state programs. Each state administers theirs a little bit different. Kansas has a state historic register, Iowa does not, and their state program has different requirements than Iowa's state historic tax credit program. But they're typically coordinated with NPS and have all of the same requirements. So anyway, so downtown Des Moines. After that redevelopment in the mid-20th century where they put in a highway, 235, knocked down a lot of historic buildings to build these skyscrapers. Now we're at a point for the National Register where 50 years has passed, and so these are now considered historic if they maintain all of those qualities that they had when they were built. So this building is the Rouen Center Complex. It is comprised of 3 buildings. And so this was really controversial when it was built. They tore down a historic classical revival building and then constructed this guy out of Corten steel, or it's clad in Corten steel. And so it essentially has to rust, or its aesthetic is rusting. So Rouen is a transportation company, a shipping company, and so they really wanted that industrial appearance for their building. So this, until relatively recently, was an office building. And so, it served that purpose for most of the 20th century, but recently, especially after the pandemic, there's less of a need for office spaces. And so a lot of these skyscrapers in downtown Des Moines have major vacancies. And so this, along with the Financial Center, which is this building, are 2 current adaptive reuse projects that are using historic tax credits to repurpose them into apartments. Because there is a housing crisis, right? And so the needs of the community shift as time develops. And so how can we maintain these resources, the sense of identity, right? They define the Des Moines skyline. How can we maintain those while also still making sure we have a thriving downtown? So the Rouen will also still have office spaces, but they're currently being converted to apartments. So is the Financial Center. So other projects that I've worked on include adapting decommissioned school buildings into apartments, rehabilitating commercial buildings in historic downtowns to help spur economic development in small rural communities, renovating historic buildings on college campuses so that those properties can meet evolving educational needs of teachers, staff, and students. So I've even worked on a project for repurposing a former post office that had a mural into a restaurant. So also, full circle moment, the TWA Flight Center also was involved in the historic tax credit program in New York. So this building closed in the early 2000s and it was recently redeveloped into a swanky hotel. So they uncovered the conversation pit, which had been covered over and reincorporated all of those elements that had been, hiding behind all of these different materials that were installed over the decades of use of this building. So they built a massive hotel around the outside of it too. So ultimately, again, my job isn't necessarily what I envisioned for myself when I was an undergrad or a grad student, when I was visiting the rehabilitated Tate Modern building in London, when I was studying post office murals, Eames architecture and exhibition designs, but it kind of culminates all of my interests and incorporates public service. So, I still read about and research historic resources. I work with historic American architecture from various periods to help assure that they continue to exist and benefit their communities in different ways. And I collaborate with people, a lot of citizens who care deeply about their communities and really want to save their historic buildings that they have a lot of emotional attachments to. So I work in government, which was continued interest from my research project, again, how the government can help support and fund cultural programs and infrastructure projects. So don't know if I'll be at the SHPO forever or if I'll eventually transition to something else, but for now I found something unexpected but rewarding. So again, if I have any advice or any moral to the story, keep yourself open to a bunch of different opportunities. You're going to be reevaluating what you want out of life constantly, and it may not look like what you originally thought when you started pursuing art or art history as a focus. So ultimately I found something that fit, that I fell in love with, and so that's a possibility.
Questions do you all have for Lorinda?
Yes.
So the National Register, is that strictly just buildings and properties, or does it go to like bridges, rivers?
Yep. Bridges, there's historic landscapes, archaeological sites. Those are locations are usually protected on those, so those are somewhat restricted. So in Iowa, we have a petroglyph site. It's on a huge rock, so the public knows where it's at. That's being nominated right now for information potential. Because we've been coordinating with tribes, and they have indicated that that site was important as a location for tracking and gauging how big buffalo herd sizes were and where their movements were. And so what can we learn more about that site is why it's being nominated. So landscapes, tons of different things can be nominated. Buildings are what we normally get because only buildings qualify for the tax credit program. And so there's a lot of money behind those nominations.
What other types of mid-century modern architecture are there? I know there's Z, which is like kind of the space age-ish type. Is there like any other types of mid-century modern?
Yeah, so a number of different types. The National Register, if we're talking about those, it has specific architectural styles that it identifies. And so if it doesn't fall into any one of those, then it's called other, and influenced by, a number of different styles. Modern is one that we see a lot frequently. So we just nominated in Iowa a 1960s ice cream store. And so that has, the glass block windows, all of the curves, things like that. So in my research, I was specifically focused on American modernism as opposed to European, because Americans seem to, consider more of the landscape and the site that buildings were located in and incorporated that into the design. Whereas if you're looking at like a Mies van der Rohe or something like that, it could be located anywhere. So, yeah. Yes.
So I know that you said that you also are involved in archaeological digs and stuff like that, and I'm assuming this spans from like when there were tribes from even many, many years ago who no longer have descendants that are still here in various parts of America, as well as probably some sites that are like post-colonization as well. So where do like the objects go from all of those, and that like is there various museums that you work specifically with, or how does that work?
So usually the most archaeological sites that are dealt with our office the archaeologists are reviewing as part of the Section 106 program, and so that is infrastructure projects that are federally funded. So you get a telephone pole that goes in, or a 5G tower, or they're putting in an oil pipeline. Those federal agencies are required to do investigations for how that project is impacting the landscape and historic resources, and so that includes archaeology. So usually those projects involve exploratory archaeological digs where they do core samples. Usually they keep those resources in the same spot. There's a lot of discussion in our office about disrupting sacred spaces or spaces that are culturally important to populations, and how we don't have ownership over those objects, especially as the federal government or state government taking possession of those. So those are recorded, documented. Their sites are restricted, so they're confidential, and we don't share any of that site information with anyone. That's maintained by the Office of the State Archaeologist, and so usually they're kept in situ, but those are the objects and things are handled by the Office of the State Archaeologist, so we work with them, but yeah.
So do you work with, like, I'm assuming that there are certain tribes though that are like consulted then?
Yes, we have an archaeologist that was hired specifically because he has a lot of experience coordinating with tribes. And so there was a recent project that was proposed by a community to do archaeological digs, and the tribe that was historically from that area said, please do not dig here. This is a sacred site. We do not want this to be disturbed. There could be human remains here. So we do not want that disturbed, just so that you can have more data and information for your own purposes. So that project was then killed. So, yeah. Any other questions? I know this is probably a different talk than you all usually get.
I know at least some of you will organize the TWA, because we actually talked about it in class this semester. Any questions for Lorinda? She does a lot more modern stuff, so she's the expert in the 20th century, so.
But I also love to talk to you all about art. I don't get to do that as much, so I'm excited to go to the reception and see what's happening at your university. So thank you.
To support the ESU Art Forum program, please visit emporia.edu/art. Click on the Events tab, scroll down to the Art Forum link and click. Then scroll down to the Support Art Forum button and click. Finally, choose your donation level and click on the Continue button to complete the process. We appreciate your support.